Right, good evening. This evening we're thinking about the subject of disappointment, and we'd hoped to have Paul Mallard with us live, but unfortunately another appointment has taken him away, so we're going to do this by video. Paul, could you just introduce yourself for anyone who doesn't know you?
Yeah, I'm the pastor of Whitcomb Baptist Church. I work with Clover. I've been in pastoral ministry for, I think this is my 37th year. Before that, I trained for a little while to be a teacher. I taught for 5 years and then was called into ministry in various parts of the country. Married to Edry, and we have 4 children, all of whom are married, and we have 7 grandchildren. And I've been here in Bath for almost 5 years now.
Thank you. Now, the reason why we're talking to Paul particularly this evening is because he's written this book, Invest Your Disappointments. Now, we're in your study, Paul, and there's a vast number of books around us that people will be able to see a very small fraction of. But actually the subject of disappointment or disappointment on a Christian book isn't actually that common. We've got much more on kind of joy or praise or prayer or other things. Why did you write a book on the subject of disappointment?
I think the genesis of it was really a conference I spoke at, a conference called Word Alive, which is a conference open to families and to everybody really, but with a huge number of students present. And I was asked to do a series of 4 seminars on living as a Christian in a fallen and broken world, and things like prodigal children, dealing with disability. My wife, I should say, has been suffering from multiple sclerosis for a couple of decades and more, and a variety of subjects. But the first one was disappointment, and as you say, there's not much written on it, so I kind of searched around a bit and couldn't find much, but I did what I could, got stuff together. When I turned up at the meeting, they said you'll probably get about 30, maybe 40 people to this seminar. When I turned up, there were 3 elderly ladies sitting on the front row, and I thought, well, this will be an interesting discussion on the nature of disappointment. I should have realised that it was a student conference, so if the meeting began at 11 o'clock, there's no one there at 1 minute to 11. At 1 minute past 11, everybody turns up. And by the time everyone had turned up, I think we must have had 200 people squashed into a room. And I spoke and then offered to talk to people afterwards. And I think myself and other counsellors must have been talking for the best part of, I don't know, an hour and a half. And it just dawned on me how deep-seated disappointment is within the lives of so many people. So having had that experience, I kind of reflected on my own years of ministry, and suddenly kind of came to my attention that is such a common problem, and there's very little written on it, and yet the Bible is full of it from beginning to end. Disappointed people coming to God and trying to find an answer in Him. And so I thought it'd be helpful to write something that was both faithful to the Bible, because that's where we find the help to minister, but also honest about the real questions that people ask and the real experiences they go through.
Now, instinctively, some of us may feel that actually the reason why there's not much written on disappointment is because, in some senses, it's a sub-Christian emotion. I should be, if I know what Jesus has done for me, if I know who God is, then I should be a man of joy and passion, and and actually disappointment isn't something that should feature in my life. But you're saying otherwise, and you're saying that the scriptures reflect that as a reality.
You should be a man of joy and passion, but joy and disappointment are not mutually exclusive. It's interesting. We had a lady in one of my churches who was absolutely convinced that the way in which a Christian should live, and the word that she used is, we need to press on until we reach a level of, and the word she used was serenity. Christians should be serene people. You have these pictures of the swan on the pool, and it's kind of going along. We know that its feet are paddling underneath, but it's serene. Serenity isn't a Christian word or a Christian emotion. If you're a Buddhist, you can be serene, but Jesus was not serene. Jesus was deeply disappointed at particular moments in his life. So he was disappointed with his disciples. Doesn't mean he gave up on them. Clearly means that disappointment in itself can't be sinful because Jesus didn't sin. There's a sense in which, and I don't want to kind of go into this in too much depth because it's a very deep subject, there was a sense in which in his human nature there was a level of disappointment as he looked at the cross. He looked beyond the cross and he knew that it was God's purpose, and he knew that there would be amazing blessing. But as he's in the garden there, the disappointment, the pain in anticipation of what would happen when he went to the cross is almost overwhelming, and so on. So are we allowed to be disappointed? I would put the question the other way around. It's impossible not to be disappointed. The Bible is full of it. So you think of our first parents, Adam and Eve. They sin. Sin comes into the world. They have two boys. The first one turns out to be a murderer. They lose the second one to his brother. Can you imagine the level of disappointment? And that's what it is to be in a fallen world. Now the way we respond to it, it's like a lot of the things that happen in our lives, the way in which we respond to it shapes the people we are. But I could take you to almost any part of the Bible and show you people who are struggling with disappointment of some sort or another. You think of Job, you think of the book of Psalms. In my quiet time this morning, I was in Psalms around the mid-70s, and a couple of them there are just cries out to God. You know, why are my circumstances like this? How can I go through it? You think of the apostles in the New Testament. You think of Paul disappointed in his circumstances. So number one, it's inescapable. Number two, it's not necessarily a sinful response. If we were Hindus or Buddhists, and our idea was to cut ourselves off from all emotion and for any engagement with people and with the world, then we could be in this kind of serene nirvana existence. We're not Buddhists, we're Christians. And as Christians, we engage with people, we engage with church, we engage with circumstances. And if you engage, there is always the possibility of disappointment. So for those reasons, I think it's inescapable. And how we respond is the key thing. What we do about it is the key thing. Yeah.
So just to be clear on that, because this could be very very close to home for someone who's with us this evening. How we respond to disappointment is what we should focus on, and we're going to discuss that in a moment. But in that initial sense of disappointment, some Christians will feel a tremendous burden of guilt that their feeling of guilt or of disappointment, reflects some fundamental ingratitude at what God has done for them, and they'll end up in a spiral feeling even worse. And what you're saying is actually that isn't our start. We've got to think how we respond to disappointment. But the very fact we're experiencing it doesn't mean that we're somehow offending God with our lack of whatever.
Absolutely. It's like so many things in life. We often think in an unbiblical way. And we have all sorts of thoughts come into our mind. I mustn't let the side down. I've got to be constantly joyful. I've got to be victorious. I've got to be above these circumstances. Well, again, you just need biblical reality. You need to look at what people in the Bible actually say. Something like 50 out of 150 Psalms begin or touch at some point on the darkness of human experience. We can't escape suffering. We can't escape suffering because we are human. We can't escape suffering because we are Christians. In fact, most of the teaching in the New Testament about suffering is because of the fact that we're following Jesus. He's a crucified Saviour. So I think at the initial stage, we have to be honest. I mean, part of our problem is that we like to wear masks. I've often said that Christians tell lies. When do they tell lies? Well, 12 o'clock on a Sunday lunchtime when you're shaking hands on the door. How are you doing? I'm doing okay. And you know that their lives are falling apart. We've got to wear a mask. We've got to pretend. Now, there's a difference between wearing a mask and wearing your heart on your sleeve, which again can be too much. But if we are facing genuine, true disappointment, which is inevitable in a fallen world, where we enter into relationships that sometimes go awry, or people we love walk away, or people we love die, in that kind of world, how can you not be disappointed? And so we must not feel guilty. We must say this is part and parcel of the Christian's experience. If it was the experience of Jesus, how can it not be my experience?
So if that's our starting point, I mean, your book is called Invest Your Disappointments, Going for Growth.
Yeah.
Now, invest is a positive word. We think about investing money, we think about investments, and so forth. Whereas our initial thought with the things that disappoint would be, one, how can I avoid them? And then when they happen, how can I kind of minimise them or mask them by turning something else? The very title of your book suggests quite a different approach to what to do when you're facing into a disappointment.
Yeah.
Can you, I mean, obviously you've got a book on it, but can you outline why invest and what, in basic form, that looks like?
Yeah. It's based on a theology, which is that God is in sovereign control of our lives, that he's completely wise, and that he is always, for the Christian believer, acting in love. Martin Luther was once asked, how do you sleep at night when you've got all these burdens? And he said, I sleep because I put my head on three pillows. The pillow of God's sovereign power, the pillow of God's grace and love towards me, and the pillar of his wisdom. And putting my head on those three pillows, I sleep. There are three things that help us to understand who God is. The first is that in our circumstances, even the disappointments, God is sovereign. He doesn't, it's not something that's come into my life that's somehow come under his radar. Now that doesn't make it easy, and that doesn't mean that I'm glad when it happens. You know, if a really painful experience comes, a real disappointment, you know, the breakdown of a marriage, or a child walking away from God, a prodigal child, or sickness or unemployment, you know, those things are incredibly painful, and I don't rejoice in them. I don't say, that's great, you know, I'd like a bit more of this, but I don't also put them outside God's plan. I don't say, well, you know, God couldn't have seen this coming. I believe I'm in the hands of God. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I believe that God is all wise. He has a plan, he has a purpose. And part of the purpose in disappointment, there can be a range of purposes. Sometimes it's to get my attention. Sometimes it's to shake up the way in which I look at the world. You know, when my wife became very, very ill, I almost lost her 27 years ago when she first had MS. When that happened, it got me thinking about her place in my relationship with her. And I realised that I loved God more than her. And that's right, because the more I love God, the more I'm able to love her. But it was the disappointment of being in the hospital and waiting for results that make you suddenly come face to face with the fact God knows what he's doing here. He's sometimes stripping away things that we depend on so we can understand his purposes. And the third thing, and this is the key thing, I think, is that everything God does is out of love. Even when he's doing something in order to chasten us, to draw us back, it's out of love. And it's those three things together, that understanding of the character and the nature of God, that helps us to say, okay, here is something that is deeply hurtful, and I'm not going to undermine the hurt, and I'm not going to pretend it's not there, and I'm not going to do everything to deal with it. You know, if there's sickness, see the doctor, get as much help as you can. But the question is, if this is part of God's plan for my life to shape me, what can I learn in a positive way? What can make me more like Jesus in this situation? Mm-hmm. So investing is kind of saying, this is not an accident, this is not a mistake, this is something that can be of real positive value, as long as my heart attitude is right. Because that's the key thing. One of my wife's favourite phrases when she's going through real tough times because of her MS is, you know, this experience can make me bitter or it can make me better, and the choice is mine. And that's a simple way of looking at it. My choice, my heart choice in this situation is to either grieve in a way that drives me away from God, or grieve in a way that drives me into his hands. And grief is part and parcel of human experience. If we get engaged and if we love, we will grieve when we lose the things that we love.
So are you saying that in order to invest our disappointment and essentially gain something valuable from it is directly linked to how much we actually prize Christ and becoming like him ourselves?
Absolutely. The Bible tells us to prize a whole series of things. I prize my wife, I prize my kids, I love being a pastor. And again, as Christians, we're not Buddhists, we're not this wonderful serenity, these statues of the Buddha staring into the distance, nothing troubles me, I'm beyond that. We prize those things, and we're preaching through Ecclesiastes at the moment. You have these little moments where he says, okay, life is tough and life actually is full of disappointments, but if God sits you down to a nice meal with the family, enjoy it. Enjoy what you've got. Don't become some weird ascetic. In fact, in the New Testament, Paul calls extreme asceticism the doctrine of demons. Don't come from God. God gives you everything richly to enjoy. So enjoy it while you've got it. But realise that every enjoyment you've got is second to knowing Christ. And it's quite easy for those enjoyments to begin to block out our love for Christ. If we love Christ, if we prize him most, if we love him more than anything else, then we can never lose him. My wife and I have been married this year for 40 years, and her health is not very good. So we talk the last couple of Christmases. One Christmas will be our last Christmas. And we've talked about that openly, and so let's enjoy Christmas as much as we possibly can, because who knows? Who knows which? Some guys here I know exactly that same experience. But the point is, as we think about it, we come to realise that even the most precious human experience in the end can't satisfy and can't last. For every married couple who delights in a God-given partner, one day you will be separated. But the one person you can never be separated from, and the one person who will always satisfy, is Christ. So disappointments drive us back to the reality of knowing Jesus. And it's not always even that we've loved something or someone too much. It's not God saying, I'm going to punish you, or I'm going to bring you back. Sometimes our heart has cherished Christ more than anything else, and we still lose something we love. And in those circumstances, what we come to see is that Jesus is enough in those situations.
And what's the place of heaven in all this? Because it's easy, isn't it, to say to someone who's disappointed, look, it's essentially an all's well, ends well type of sounding thing. Don't worry, they're there. One day it'll all be fixed. Now, obviously, there's truth in that, but how can our hope of a place without disappointment, and in fact with a greater fulfilment of everything good than we can imagine now, how can we start to have that invade our disappointments today, as it were, to actually make a difference?
Yeah. Well, as you say, heaven is the one ultimate place of no disappointment. And so folk who think in some weird way you can escape into a disappointment-free realm in this world have not read Revelation 21. There's no more pain or sickness or suffering or death. Why does John say that? Because that doesn't occur until then. So it's absolutely right. I think my wife lost her sister when her sister was in her late 20s, I think, and my wife was in her teens when her sister died. And she said the first thing that after the initial grief, the first thing that became a reality to her was the reality of heaven. I don't think of heaven as a teenager, but she did. She said, because somebody I loved Lizzie is there. So one of the things that disappointment does as we lose those things is it makes us realise how brief this life is, how short it is. Richard Baxter, who was the pastor up in Kidderminster, who lived into his 80s, if not his 90s, towards the end of his life, I think from his 70s onwards, he would spend half an hour every day meditating on the verses in the Bible that speak about eternity, that speak about heaven. He filled his mind with thoughts about it. So I think hope is a kind of a neglected virtue in the New Testament. But when you go through pain and disappointment, what you come to realise is that hope is essential as part of the Christian's vocabulary, Christian experience, that this world will always leave us disappointed. And so thinking about what the Bible teaches, thinking about the things that we love, which we've lost for a while, I think that's one of the things that helps us in that situation. Yeah. It's not a cop-out to say heaven, all these things will be gone. In fact, it's exactly what Jesus says. It's exactly what Paul says. If there is no heaven, if there's no resurrection, if there's no future life, then actually we must forget it all. It just doesn't make any sense. You might as well eat, drink, and be merry. But if there is a heaven, everything is different. The problem is, because we live in this world, and rightly so, and we're engaged in this world and fully engaged in this world becomes the reality in front of our eyes. And we forget that we're only pilgrims here for a short period of time.
So just moving on from what Christ and Paul tell us, to focus on the reality of heaven, that we should genuinely have a hope there and things will be different there. That's what they say to us. Can you share something just personally of the things over the long struggles you've been with, and people will know that, or some people will know that those don't end with Edry. You've got a very poorly grandson and other things. But in that, what have been the things that people have said to you that have been particularly helpful, or things that people have done that have helped you walk with your disappointments? And perhaps also, what are the times where people perhaps have tried to say something helpful but have actually misstepped and said something that was actually not?
You mentioned my grandson Abraham, who when he was first born was appeared to be normal, and then was diagnosed with a very rare form of brain damage, which means he's blind. He'll never speak. He'll never know his parents, and so on. So we lived through that with our daughter and son-in-law, and.
Sorry, just on that, you're living through it, aren't you, Abraham?
Well, we're still living through it.
Yeah,
he's still with it. Yeah. I mean, he's about 15 months old now, I think. And when it first happened, we were with them in the hospital, and then I heard the diagnosis over the phone, and then the following day we went to see them. And to be honest, okay, you asked what do you say in that situation. To be honest, when we sat there in the room, the first time we met, we said virtually nothing. We just told them we loved them. We didn't try and come up with any, well, of course this is for your best, and this is really going to help, and this is, I believe all that stuff, but there's a time and a place to say it. And as we rose to leave, my wife just put her arms around Kezia, my daughter, and it must have been for a full 5 minutes. Kezia just sobbed and sobbed into her shoulder. No words. Just now, I think at that moment in time that was exactly the right thing. That was far more eloquent than anything that we could ever have said. Having said that, afterwards you process things and you begin to work through things, and you begin to look at the truths that are helpful. I think just quoting verses from the Bible at random are not particularly helpful, but I think a couple of things. Talking about heaven and the reality. When we had a little dedication service for Abraham, we talked about his dignity and we talked about his destiny, and I think that was helpful. But I think one of the things that has been most helpful of all, has really been when people have pointed us to Christ. Because, we talked about Buddha and so on, this serene looking into the distance. What's the symbol of Christianity? It's a cross. What do we have in Christianity? A God who tastes every aspect of human pain and human disappointment. A God who's been there. A God who's nailed to a plank and lifted up to die. A God who sympathises. A God who's been into the darkness. So without having a simplistic answer to why things happen and understand, we come to one who does know. And so the pointing to Jesus, understanding that Jesus himself sympathised, that's been the most helpful. The most unhelpful, I guess, is when people have ready-made pat answers, a nice little theology that they push in your direction. Or worse still, people who make you feel guilty, as you mentioned earlier, about letting the side down. When I mentioned my wife losing a sister, someone at church saying to her when it was a communion service and she was just overwhelmed, she was crying, and someone said to her afterwards, "You shouldn't be like that. Liz is in a better place. You shouldn't grieve like that. That's not right. As a Christian, what do you think other people will say?" Well, that was incredibly unhelpful. Incredibly, the whole kind of prosperity gospel. And it's interesting. We've gone and we talked about this. I've done an interview with myself and Edry, and you'll occasionally get questions about, which is basically, if you had enough faith, it'd be better. If I had, and well, those things are just really unhelpful.
Just one final question, and perhaps I think it's one of the most difficult subjects with disappointment, is where we're with someone, a friend, and actually their real disappointment isn't just the circumstances of life, it's with God himself. Yeah. And I'm thinking particularly of situations where people have seen a blessing come their way and they've thanked God for it, and then the blessing seems to be taken. So you have a lonely friend who finally meets someone, and it all seems to be great, and everyone's delighted, lovely, but then the engagement's broken off, and they're left devastated. You have the person who's given the all clear from cancer, and the church rejoices at that wonderful news, and then 6 months later it's back and more vigorous than it was before. How can we sensitively and authentically speak into those kinds of disappointment and help someone?
I kind of, because you told me that was one of the questions you might ask me, and I kind of thought a little bit about this, and I think there is a sense, isn't there, in which the second level of disappointment is harder, because how can lightning strike twice in one place? And it's almost as if the first time round, okay, all the things I've been saying so far, well, that's the way the world is, and God is in control and so on, and isn't the Lord wonderful? And at that point we don't necessarily blame God. But when God seems to have given it and then taken it away again, that's when we begin to think, well, who is this God? Do I really know him? Can I really know him? I mean, how could you be so mean? It's like with kids, isn't it? It's like Christmas morning giving them a present, and then a new bike, and before they go and ride on it, you say, "That's it, I'm going to take it away now and give it to the kid next door." I mean, who would be so cruel, and who would be so it is at that level of the questioning of the character of God, I guess. And I think a couple of things came to my mind. One is that again, someone once said, whatever the question is, the answer is always Jesus. And the answer is God kind or not? Does God love us or not? And the answer is that he gave his only begotten son. He gave his son for rebels. He put the salvation of rebels against the ongoing comfort of his own son, who he had loved from eternity. So back to the cross. Second thing is, I kind of thought of the example of Elijah in the Old Testament. You know the story of Elijah. Elijah is God's servant. He's a passionate man because he's passionate for God's purposes. People say you shouldn't be passionate. Well, look at Elijah. Elijah got hurt because he was passionate. His faith is under attack doesn't necessarily fail. When you know the story, 3 years they're waiting for God to come in judgment. After 3 years, there's this great confrontation on Mount Carmel, and the people appear to repent, and the rain comes, and the only thing that's in the way now is Jezebel. And once she's gone, there will be the revival he's been longing for, and it all turns to dust, and he runs. 2 things about what happens there, or 3 things. The first thing is that when he's saying to God, look, I'm the only one left, this is terrible, and so he's doing that because he cares. People are often critical, his faith had failed. His faith's stretched, but he cared. And if you care, you will be disappointed when things go against you. When you're in a church and the church goes off the rails, you'll care, and it'll hurt you deeply. We're not Buddhists, we're Christians. That's the first thing. The second thing is that God deals with him in the most gentle way possible. He doesn't rebuke him. Sometimes we say things that we don't mean in the heat of the moment. A good friend comes alongside, and what do? They comfort you. The point about Job's friends is that they were just witnesses for the prosecution rather than there to encourage him. God encourages him. He gives him a meal, he helps him to sleep, he gives him another meal, and he deals with him gently. He shows himself to Job. And then the third thing is that God assures Job that in the end, in the final purpose of things, he's got everything under control. Now for Elijah, it was, I've got the people who will deal with this problem, and Elisha will take over from you. For us, it's God's purposes will work out in the end. One day all things will be well, and all manner of things will be well. The gospel tells us that we may go through the most horrendous disappointments in this world, but one day things will be well, and one day we will understand. I think it's unhelpful to pretend that we understand everything now, but one day we will. So again, it comes down to the God I know from the Bible, the God I understand, the God who's walked with me. Can I really trust him? Is he really being cruel or not? God is incapable of being cruel. God is never cruel, even to people who reject him. When we think about hell and final judgment, there is God's wrath being poured out, and there is God's righteousness being expressed. But God is never cruel. God cannot be cruel. God cannot act in an unjust and an unkind way. So it comes down to knowing the character of Christ and the character of God. And the only way, ultimately, we know the character of God is through the framing that we get through Jesus.
Well, it's probably time for us to finish there, but just as we do, could you remind us what the 3 pillows that Luther said he slept on were?
The sovereignty of God, God is in control. The wisdom of God, God knows what he's doing. We may not, but God does. And the love of God, God never stops loving his children, not ever. Everything that happens to us, even the worst things, even the greatest disappointments, are framed and driven by his love. We never move out from being loved children. Even if we're naughty loved children and need chastening, we never stop being beloved children of God once we've trusted in Christ.
That's brilliant. Thanks for your time, Paul. Hopefully we'll get you along in person on another occasion. So over to Susanna.